Hello again, everyone. You're listening to another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. My name is Jeff Mix. I'm Executive Platform's Head of Content and Research. My guest today is Kristin Saling, the author of Data-Driven Talent Management, Using Analytics to Improve Employee Experience. Chris is a colonel in the U.S. Army who is currently serving as the Chief of Staff for the Innovation Directorate for U.S. Army Recruiting Command. In this office, she is responsible for developing, managing, and synchronizing the Army's strategy, policy, and research in talent acquisition, experimentation, and innovation. She's a graduate from the United States Military Academy who served as an engineer officer for 12 years, including 2 deployments to Iraq, before serving as the Chief Analytics Officer for the Army Talent Management Task Force and establishing the Army People Analytics Directorate. She also found the time to write an excellent book that I think any HR professional or senior executive who is interested in human resources and talent management would really enjoy. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. Chris, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, Jeff, thank you so much for having me on. All topics I love talking about. Love talking about talent management enough that I put it all in a book.
Well, I get to talk to a lot of interesting people in this podcast. I confess you're my first active serving officer and probably one of only a handful of engineers I've had the pleasure of having on the show. I expect a lot of the listeners would like to hear a little bit more about you and how you came to write a book about data analytics as it relates to talent management. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
So I fell into all of this by accident. I mean, I would love to say that there was some grand scheme and talent development that was going on, but a lot of it was a complete accident. Prior to coming to the headquarters department of the Army, G1, the Chief of Staff for Personnel, I had worked at INDOPACOM, the command for India and Pacific, as an analyst and a strategist. I was working on some very different subject matter. I was doing counter-threat finance analysis. I was doing counter-terrorist analysis, building partner capacity, a whole bunch of other things. And then kind of as a broadening assignment, my branch decided they were going to send me to headquarters, Department of the Army in the Pentagon. So I get in there, I'm looking around going, I don't know anything about personnel. I don't know anything about HR. I'm going to have to do some research. Why would they put me here? And I started looking around and realized that everything that we were doing in HQDA was on these suites of interlinked spreadsheets. It was on desktops. There were no platforms. There weren't any of the analytics tools I was used to. So I was like, oh, I know how to build partner capacity. I can work with this. So kind of dove in, started doing my old mission, going in, looking at how we were, creating these different reports, how we were doing our forecasting, and really just kind of dug into how we could create more capacity for the G1 to do longer, more accurate forecasts, to better understand the people that we were working with. And then my biggest surprise was that I really got passionate about it.
I love that. And I think it's so interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. So many HR people get into data analytics as like an evolution of their job, and you're coming at it from data analytics first, and then they were giving you an HR task to do. So
exactly.
Yeah, more than half of your career in the Army has been as an engineer. And so it was only in 2016 that you were assigned to the headquarters department of the Army G1 office. I am curious, and I'm going to skip through some because you already walked through the different deployments, but at what point in your work with data analytics with the Army Talent Management Task Force did you realize, hey, this is actually something that others can learn from? Maybe it'll be a good book one day. Like what was the process of deciding this work could be applied outside of your current task?
Honestly, the number of different conferences and different engagements we had, and because we were standing up talent management, we really wanted to look at how we were going to do HR and personnel management differently. So first thing we do as good academicians is go out and reach out to partners that we can learn from. My bosses and I spent a large amount of time going out and talking to Microsoft and to Google and to Amazon. And we were looking at Walmart, we were looking for very large companies that had the same kind of scale of people that we were looking at. Because we, all total, if you look at all 3 of our service components, active guard and reserve, and our civilian workforce, we have about 1.3 million people. So we go to an Amazon, has about 1.5 million. You've got some commensurate scale to work with. And we realized that all of us were facing a lot of the same problems. I mean, even if we had more budget, access to other different types of technology, commercial companies have a little bit easier time doing procurement and onboarding than we do because we have government bureaucracy to deal with, but we're still kind of dealing with that same amount of people problem. It's like, how much do we need to know about our people? What are the important bits? How can I use this to help them achieve their goals, but also balance that, of course, with achieving our organizational goals? So the more we did that, the more we realized that my team and I realized that the things that we were doing were things that we could turn around and teach as lessons learned, start conversations about best practices. And I ended up doing this long enough and often enough. I speak on talent management fairly routinely. Um, that people were asking, just like, hey, you've been at this for about 8.5 years now. Can we just like download your brain? How do we do that? How can we figure out all of this research and all of this, these best practices and everything else that you guys have picked up as you're reframing how the Army manages 1.3 million people? And I was like, oh, there is a way. So that's basically what my book is. It's about 8.5 years of work and experimentation. I would say non-expert work because I'm not an HR professional by background. I just kind of play one on TV. Um, and putting it into a very practical framework that I think anybody can pick up, take a look at, and go, oh, okay, I've got a way that I can get after this. I've got some things in here that'll help me tweak and solve one of my problems rather than just kind of looking at these suite of analytic tools and, okay, I bought this thing. Now what do I do with it?
Well, I will say, having read the book, if you're just playing an HR professional on TV, you're doing a very convincing job. I guess 8 years of doing anything, some things are going to rub off. I do want to say for my next question, and we're circling back to it, I am fascinated to speak to a data analytics first person rather than an HR first person. A lot of the senior executives in our network, have been focused on employee experience and talent management issues for most of their careers, and they're embracing data analytics tools and concepts as a relatively new addition to the skill set. You have come to the subject matter from a totally different direction than most people, and then you've written a book about it. What are some of the things you want to highlight for them about what data analytics can really do for an HR department?
I think that was one of the things that was really a good fit for me coming in from data analytics into HR, because we look for problems to solve. We look to understand processes. We look to find things for improvements. And a lot of times we come in not really knowing the lay of the land. So your data professionals always work best when you partner them up with a subject matter expert so that you can get a nice little bit of cross-pollination, understanding the process and the workflows and the experience models and everything else that we use to improve HR processes. You pair that with data analytics, and you've got somebody who can set out the metrics, who can do OKRs, who can give you the quantitative, and often with the tools we have right now for natural language processing and other and generative AI, we can do a lot of qualitative work that was difficult to do previously. So we can really take things out of the assumptions we make in order to do our jobs and put some rigor behind them.
Why don't we get into the book specifically, which, again, I will say, for the record, I have to read some business books in my line of work, and this is a better read than you would think data-driven talent management is going to be. The book starts off by talking about leading talented teams in an age where we can put numbers to a lot of things, but we still always need to remember we're talking about people. Before we go too far into the specifics about data analytics and AI tools and what they can do, can you talk a little bit about the people part of all this? What do we hope readers are going to be able to do for their teams and their team members?
Well, I think what everybody wants to do if you're in a leadership position is build that all-star team that you can go and you can take and you can put out in the field, whether it's, the battlefield that we use or a sports field or just the business field, and get them to win. So in order to do that, you have to figure out what those winning characteristics are. You want to figure out how to measure those and identify them along the entire kind of employee experience journey or the talent management journey, from the point you identify them to acquiring, developing, employing, retaining. And in our case, in the Army, we transition them because we're a net exporter of talent. Businesses, I think, have very similar ways of looking at this. But that's what we want to be able to do, is sit there and say, okay, where is this talent going? What do I need to bring in? What kind of raw material do I need to bring in? How much shaping do I want to do? Where are my developmental positions? Where do I need somebody just to hit the ground running? Making decisions like that is one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book. But also for the person who is looking at being part of one of those talented teams, it helps you to figure out, what are you bringing to the table? Who's bringing other skills to the table, and how do you best work together?
So let's talk about data and analytics as it relates to human resources. In your book, you use the analogy that you can't make bricks without clay, and data is a foundation upon which the quality of everything else that follows is built. Can you talk a little bit about what kind of data makes sense for HR professionals looking to improve their talent management and employee experience processes?
Well, we have tons of transactional human capital data just as part of managing our folks. And that's not often what we look for when it comes to talent management. What we're looking for are really the markers of what somebody can do. Now, in the Army, we made a lot of assumptions, again, kind of tend to turn those assumptions into facts so that you have that foundation of data. Um, as we're going through and looking at that, we want to see like what are the actual indicators of what somebody can do. We laid out pretty quickly that, okay, we've got a particular rank, somebody has a particular branch that they're in, whether they're in, engineer, field artillery, cyber, whatever the case may be. And then we can make a lot of assumptions. So it's like, how can we get in there and quantify using anything like skills-based assessments, personality assessments? What are the other pieces of data that we can collect to say what somebody is actually good at? And then we want to look at, and this is a shock to the Army system, of what do they actually like to do? How do they want to grow? Where are they incentivized? And how can we apply appropriate incentives to say, all right, we actually need more people to do this thing over here. It's not popular. How can we make it more popular and drive people toward as a particular goal?
Yeah. I love that part. And I think my next question sort of expands upon it a little. Your book talks about leveraging data to understand competencies, and I found that fascinating. I think one of the great challenges facing anyone who works with people is trying to put a reliable metric to what a person does or is capable of. When someone is applying for a job, of course, they're putting their best foot forward. When a manager is supervising someone, they don't necessarily want to put down an unfair number next to an evaluation of their work. How should data analytics look at something as soft as assessment data?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of this is tricky because it turns into a philosophical question. I mean, you never thought you'd be having a philosophical argument when you're talking about data and analytics, but it really comes down to the question of what is good. You say, we need the best officers for this particular job. Well, that's great. What is best? And what are they best at? So even if we have soft skills, we have to have some kind of a rubric, some kind of a grading scale to say, okay, this person is an A plus at, building coalitions. This person is not so good at that, but they happen to be an A plus at, any number of different things that you could be looking for.
Organizational skills.
Yeah, exactly. But it gives you a framework to be able to say, okay, this person is good, this person is medium, this person is average. And we really want to get into the predictive lane of saying, okay, this person is okay, but they really could be good.
Right. Yeah. If pointed in the right direction, where they're going to grow.
Right.
From there, you point out that when you understand someone's competence and their motivation, you can get an accurate measurement of their performance. Can you walk through some of your thoughts there?
So we've been batting around how we're going to do Army evaluations for a while, which is where a lot of this thinking came up. We were looking at performance and potential, but so let's look at the actual things that comprise performance. I mean, a person could be an extremely high achiever, and they might be that person who's bright but unmotivated in the back of your class. They're capable of great things, but they're just really not going forward. So the behavior that you want to see and the performance that you want to get out of somebody ends up being that linkage between their capability, which you can develop, and their motivation, which you can incentivize. So having kind of a base understanding of where somebody is, both in that capability and that motivation, tells you where you can work with them most and where you can apply incentives, where you can provide that mentorship and guidance and direction on what positions you want them to take and how you want them to develop and grow. And a lot of this sounds like it's extremely, in-depth work, in-depth mentorship and guidance for a particular employee. But that's, again, kind of where the data analytics and automation comes in. That lets you do this type of work at a much greater scale because we have the processing power and we have data to work with. You still have to have that human element that we talked about a little bit before, because you're going to look at how all of these different factors come together, and it's a person. It is a person, and as a complexity scientist by background, people are the ultimate complex system. There are emergent behaviors that come out of nowhere all the time. So it's always very interesting to see how these play out.
One of the reasons I love having conversations with HR professionals is, even when they're talking about metrics, even when they're talking about data, they're like, but let's not forget it's an individual, and individuals, at some point they are going to be themselves. So,
Exactly.
from there in your book, you were saying the importance of key performance indicators. And I'm curious, from your perspective, how should people identify the key performance indicators that actually matter? There are so many things you can measure. There's so many things that you can say are important. What makes a really good KPI?
So for KPIs, I mean, you really have to be able to walk the story back to what you're trying to achieve. I mean, the worst thing we do with metrics is we put out metrics that end up becoming targets, and we need to have the best at this. Well, what was the original purpose for it? How can we walk that story back to what we were trying to achieve? So as you're looking at your KPIs, yes, you want them to be specific and measurable, but you want them to be able to feed back into the story that you wanted to be able to tell. Like, what was the original objective that you set out for that particular employee or that team or that directorate or however this whatever size of organization for its performance? And as you're going out and finding things to measure that tell you whether or not you're achieving those particular objectives, that story has to walk back and has to stay in context. If it hasn't come out, I'm very big on making sure things stay in context.
No, that's great. Having touched on motivation briefly, I want to expand upon how your book talks about leveraging data to understand engagement and motivation. You get into motivation models, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and how you can see individuals and teams engage over time. Now, I appreciate that's a lot of content, but maybe you could give us an overview of some of that in your book.
A lot of that came from, just 23 years of walking around in an Army uniform. And then trying to understand why certain things work. Because it was a very big kind of aha moment for me, just thinking, walking around, I don't remember if it was one of the schools I did or one of my deployments, it's like, wow, I really don't want to do this. We all have to do this. Nobody else wants to. How do I make myself actually want to do this? I mean, I know we have to, we know we have to get there. Oh, and I've got a whole bunch of other people that I can't make do this unless they want to do this. How do I make them want to do this? So that kind of turned into a lot of study and analysis on looking at those particular motivation models. I also cheat a little bit on that. My mother is a behavioral neuroscientist, so we have some pretty nerdy conversations when it comes down to it. I actually had her proofread my motivation chapter. But as we go through the different models, you really just have to figure out ways of turning the people that you have from how many into who. So what are they interested in? What are they incentivized by? Can we learn to predict what type of things in engagement and in motivation that certain groups of people will be interested in? Because we're going to have lots of different people who want to do particular things and might not be incentivized by the things we typically think they're going to be incentivized by. Like when you're dealing with folks in the Army all the time, it's like, okay, we're doing these particular jobs. Do people like a bonus? Yeah, they like a bonus. Are there other things they might like even better? Like we have a career intermission program that allows people to go and either get degrees knocked out or any number of different things that just kind of put service on pause and they can come out. A lot of them will stay for opportunities like that, advanced civil schooling that we pay for. A number of other different benefits that are not just kind of, straight putting money at the problem. But I think the more we can understand the kind of things people are interested in, lately we've been talking a lot about remote work, hybrid work, telework environments. A lot of people are incentivized to work really, really hard when they don't have to move their families. So that's
Right.
something that we've been looking at, like, how can we expand this and retain some of the folks that we really want to retain who otherwise might just say, hey, you're making me move every 2 years. I don't want to do this anymore.
And it's so interesting to hear you say that because, again, you're the first active duty officer that I've been interviewing, but I have a lot of conversation with HR executives, and they're all about what are some alternatives for compensation, for benefits, for retention strategies that aren't just putting money in someone's hand, because you can do that for a while, but at the end of the day, there are people who are motivated by other things, and when you want people to stay, it really is understanding what matters to them. So that's a great point.
It's a culture piece too. Sorry.
No, please.
But no, it's a culture piece. I read a very interesting kind of thought piece by a friend of mine. He does a lot on what it takes to actually retain talent. And he said, don't take the bonus. It's not going to change what about the culture in the organization you're leaving. And so I started thinking like, oh, this is significant. If I'm trying to lure somebody back in with money into a culture that they're not a good fit for, or they're not happy with, I'm not solving their problem at all. How can I solve the problem with an individual person? And what about the company culture is it that they don't like?
Absolutely. So I think that actually sets up the next question beautifully. And it's also where your book pivots. It starts talking about and understanding how different people contribute to a team, how different teams work, and how data analytics can help leaders guide their organizations to positive growth and change personally and professionally as individuals, as teams, and across the larger organization. What are some of the big takeaways you hope senior executives might gather from that part of the book?
I really want them to think about how people operate together, how they operate apart, just kind of the nature of work. Because we get into, you've seen the debates everywhere. It's like, oh, we need to not do remote work. We need to not do hybrid. Nobody wants to go to the office anymore. Basically, the one size fits all solution that organizations have been going after really doesn't work for everybody. I mean, I have a talk I give routinely that's called one size fits none. And that's really kind of what we go into. It's like, how do we get a level of personalization that makes work for people? But at the same time, a lot of our work is done in teams. I mean, as a data and analytics professional, we said before, it's like we need partners to provide context for the data and the analytics and the solutions that we're producing. So we're going to work in teams. When we work in teams, we're really powerful. And in order to be able to do that and add that element of personalization in there, we've got to basically construct a Venn diagram with the needs of the individual and the needs of the team, and give executives and leaders tools to bring those sides of the Venn diagram to the largest amount of overlap. So by kind of breaking it down again to the fundamentals, looking at the nature of work, how people need to work, where they need to work, it really helps you figure out, a hybrid plan or a work schedule, flexible work, if all of these different things that people are looking at actually work for your type of work, and how to make them work in a way that gets you the results you want.
I've so far avoided talking about AI. First of all, I have to think you've been working in that long before it came to the public consciousness. But with that said, this is a business podcast in 2024. I have to ask you what your experience has been like working on these issues with data analytics tools that we would probably brand as AI today. And how do you think the sudden embrace of AI tools is going to continue to shape how people work on talent management and the employee experience? What does the future hold?
So I'm very excited about the explosion of generative AI. There are a lot of people who sit there and go, "Oh, it's this," but that, I mean, I've been working in AI technologies probably since 2013, 2012. And a lot of people look at the recent explosion, but you got to remember that AI is still being judged by the Turing test, and Alan Turing passed away in the 1950s. So we've had these concepts around for a long time, even if we haven't had the compute power and the technology to be able to make them work. Lately, what we've seen is an explosion of very easy interfaces for people to actually interact with this technology, whereas, we used to have them on mega supercomputers. This is the best one. Everybody who uses a app or uses facial recognition to unlock their phone, or who uses one of the number of different traffic apps, or who uses any kind of recommendation engine. I mean, Amazon, you're interacting with AI on the regular. So I think one of the things that AI has been doing for us lately is just making people understand just how much of it is out there, and how much of it has just kind of very quietly started making our digital experience better. So I think the future, as we keep going, is more people looking at experience expectations. So I do get after that a little bit in the book, as we're looking at differences in customer experience or employee experience. If you have somebody, we talk about the example of permanent change of station moves a lot in the Army. If you have somebody who's used to being able to pick up their phone and track where their pizza delivery is at any moment, they're going to get a little annoyed if they can't track where their personnel packet is, or if they can't track where their goods are when they're doing a permanent change of station move, or they can't track where they are in the queue to be able to get childcare on post. Those differences in experiences end up being fairly jarring if they're significant. And those actually help us find ways to say, all right, we've got a use case here. This is what people are looking for. These tools exist. We can go build them. And I think we're going to see more of a proliferation of that digital experience through our regular interactions.
I wonder if we can talk about the reader, the intended audience for this book. You didn't write it for Army executives. You wrote it for business executives. You use the benchmarks of like a Walmart or an Amazon, or even just any company with a lot of people where data analytics is going to be a powerful tool to help them do well. What do you hope a reader is going to get when they buy this book and they go, I can apply this to problems in my organization? What are some of the case studies and the real world examples where this tool is going to be powerful for them?
Well, I mean, one of the easiest ones to look at is, how are you onboarding people? What is their experience on, what do you want them to walk into in terms of your company when they first come online? And then you can start walking through that experience. We have a digital experience when they're applying for the job. There are packets being exchanged. There's a hiring experience. They've gone through all of that, and then they're coming into some type of an onboarding experience where they're learning more about the company, they're learning more about their roles and responsibilities. So how are we capturing information from that experience to help it get better? I think one of the things that we do in that particular case is I try to lead a lot of folks through a story. It's like, here's your new hire. This person is walking into their office for the first time. How are they greeted? How are they prepared for that day? Do they know where they're going to be located, where their boss is, where all the resources are, where they're going to get their IT, all these other pieces? Because as you're doing that, you're effectively setting the stage for the talent management culture in your organization. Now, it's one of the things too is a big example that we're working on for the Army, is we have our great big splashy Army pages that recruit people, and then you kind of come in and our digital experience really needs a little bit of work. So is that the kind of onboarding experience you want for your employee? What I would hope this book does is kind of give you enough stories. We do a couple case studies in there, but a lot of it is what, trying to go pull on common experiences for folks. And I use a lot of pop culture for this, kind of telling that story and going, okay, how does that particular thing look and feel? And coming back to what we talked about before, how do we measure the soft skills? It's like, how does it look and feel? How do I know if it's good? How do I know if people like it? How do I collect that data and information? And if it's university not liked, how do I figure out what about it we don't like so that we can improve it?
I am not an HR professional, and I am also not a statistician or a data scientist. I found the book very accessible for me as someone who has spoken to subject matter experts, but is not himself a subject matter expert. When you were writing it, did you have an intention, this is going to help C-suite HR executive talk to their team? Did you think this is how I'm going to help a data scientist help an HR team reform? Like, who was your intended reader? I probably both, but I mean, did you have someone in mind?
I did. I really wanted to look at all different levels of the HR professional spectrum and just say, as you're thinking about this, I'm not going to give you a lot of statistics and formulas. And the same thing for the data professional. I'm not going to give you the just hard theory and science of HR. What I'm going to do is give you a very practical framework to be able to contextualize what it is you want to do to improve your employee experience so that you can have that conversation and then among experts decide how exactly you're going to go about it. It's one of the things that we do with data and analytics is we really have to try to tailor the solutions to how the particular organization uses information. It's not a one size fits all. You can buy a tool and it's going to work great for this one company and might work horribly for yours. But if you're kind of co-building that solution between the analyst and the expert, using some of this framework for context, you got a better chance of at least everybody having a common understanding of what the problem is and where you want to go.
I actually really appreciated that you didn't get so specific on the technical issues, because I think that can date a book, right?
Oh
5
yeah,
years
I
from now,
can't.
10
It
years from
changes
now,
too fast.
yeah, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, this book is still going to be valuable because it's talking about concepts. And the concepts, when they're proven at a scale like the US Army, that's not going to change. I mean, philosophically, 20 years from now, we might have a different generation that works in a different way. But realistically, this book is going to be useful for the career of whoever's reading it.
That's my goal.
We've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. If there were a couple of key points about data-driven talent management you want people to think about further while they're waiting for their chance to read it, what would you want to highlight for them?
So I really want to highlight, even as a data and analytics professional, that when it comes to people, it's about people. And the data is to help you get from how many to who. So getting to know that person, getting to know what it is they want, but the data and analytics allow you to do it at scale and do it more rapidly. So we want to think of data and analytics, again, kind of as we come in, like partnering with that subject matter expert, it's your enabler. It is the capability that's going to let you go in and improve decisions, make them faster. But I think the caveat I want to put in there is that you really have to think about the decision and the story, because if you don't, if you just try to put the data and analytics in there, all it might do is help you make a bad decision faster.
Well, I think that's a terrific note to end on. Chris, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you for writing such a timely and valuable book for HR professionals and other senior leaders.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Once again, everyone, the book is Data-Driven Talent Management, Using Analytics to Improve Employee Experience by Kristin Saling. It's one of the latest releases from Kogan Page, a publisher I hope I will get to collaborate with again soon in the future. For everyone who's been listening to this, I encourage you all to get a copy. I wasn't kidding when I said I enjoyed a book about data-driven talent management, so it must be good. You've been listening to another episode of Executive Platform's Blueprint podcast series. I've been Jeff Mix. Let's do it again soon.